Okay, we're going to have a little look at the gusset now. Now, as I said in the quilting video, if you wanted to, you could have quilted these panels together. So you could have put your lining on the wrong side of your wadding, your foam, and quilted through all three layers. So the lining, the exterior and the foam. However, I haven't done that. I've just quilted the outside bit and I've quilted it to my foam. And now I'm going to add my lining. So with my exterior panel right sides down, I'm going to pop my lining on top, right sides up, so that we've got effectively a sandwich. And I'm just going to clip it together to make sure that all the edges are matched. And both my lining and exterior were interfaced before I did any of this, which just gives an extra level of support to the bag. You have to remember is that this bag is going to be carrying a lot of weight and we don't really want it to sag. It's been designed so that the back of the bag will bulge out slightly to accommodate the back of your press, so it doesn't stay entirely square. It depends what size your press is, of course. So we don't need any additional stabilizer in this part. So I've clipped it all together and now I'm just going to baste stitch around the exterior at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. It doesn't matter whether you do this from the lining side or the exterior side. This is just to kind of hold it all together. If you've quilted through all three layers, you probably won't need this to do this bit. I just find it makes it easier when you're excuse me, constructing the bag, if your exterior edges are all nicely basted down, because although the quilting will hold it together to a certain extent, you get little gapes at the side unless you've quilted right to the very edges of your fabric. Make sure you pull this nice and tight so that the lining isn't baggy or saggy on the back. So just give it a little pull over just to make sure that it's nice and taut. When I base stitch, I'm using a number 6 stitch, a stitch length of 6 on my machine. Not every machine has a stitch that's that long. But you'll be delighted to know that we won't actually be removing any of these base stitches. A lot of the basting that I do on some of my patterns, you have to remove it all, and that's a pain in the bum. But this base stitching stays in place, so it's one less chore to get through. There we go. I'm just going to trim off the threads, and then we need some of our binding. So I've cut this little bit 5 inches wide, so it's the same width as the end of my gusset panel, and I'm going to lay it on the end of my gusset panel with the open edges of the binding. And just turn that around so you can see the open edges of the binding where the fold is are against the raw edge of my exterior panel. And I'm going to stitch that in place. You can clip it if you want to. I find that with a short piece like this it's not necessary. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just back stitching a couple of stitches at the beginning and the end. Now I've actually put a size 16 needle in my machine because we are going through quite a lot of layers here, and it just helps to go through without any problems. Turn my work over, and as we did with the flaps, and let me just show you, the flaps are all completed now. They're all bound, and look at those perfect corners at the bottom. I'm really chuffed with those. they've kind of come out beautifully, and actually on the reverse as well you've got the lovely mitered corners. So both of those are all completed, and we're going to basically be doing the same thing here. So we're going to pull our binding from the lining side over to the right side, and I'm just going to clip it in place. You're not going around any curves, so you don't have to kind of ease at all. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other end, so I just need to cut off 5 inches of binding, so 15. So open edge towards the raw edge of the gusset, and we're only doing this on the short edge. And again. Let's just move those. And again, pulling that binding out and over to the right side, and clipping it in place. Remember, you're not folding when you're folding the binding over, you're not folding the foam or the exterior fabric. You're just pulling this binding over the top of the seam allowance. And I'm going to hand stitch this again. So if you really want to do machine stitching, you can do, and you're just going to stitch along the very edge of this sort of folded edge of your binding, and on this straight edge it's actually really easy to do. However, if you're going to hand stitch the side panels, it will look a little odd. So I'm just going to do exactly the same as I did previously on the sides. I'm just going to make sure that my knot is sort of out of the way and not visible, and then a couple of threads there. I'm just going to use my needle to tuck them back underneath the binding, and then I'm just going to use, and say I'm using a whip stitch because this is my stitch of choice when it comes to binding. Ladder stitch you can use, you can even, and I have done this before, use a running stitch along the very edge. You do need to be sure that you're able to stitch a running stitch nice and neatly and keep your stitches really tidy and even, because they will be visible. But it looks, if you use a contrast thread, you almost get a look a little bit like, now I don't know if I'm going to say this right, I think it's called sashiko. It's a sort of a stitching embroidery type thing, oriental kind of stitching, where the stitching is hand stitched, running stitched to make designs on things, but you'd almost get the effect of that on the edge of your binding if you used a contrast thread. But it's personal preference. Those of you that are quilters will probably use ladder stitch because that's pretty much traditionally what was used on quilts. Let's just get my thread down on my needle a bit further. Now, I'm not going to bore you having you sit and watch me stitch both ends on, because they are exactly the same, and there's only so much hand sewing you can watch. But I'll just get this end on and show you, and then I'll get on and stitch the other end off camera, and then we'll start making some progress with our strap and attaching our strap to our side panels. And then we come on to the pockets. The hand stitching takes a little while, so that's what gives this bag its sort of long, you need to give yourself a little bit of time to do it. It's not a quick sew, and there are lots of pieces in this bag, but an awful lot of them are exactly the same, so it's not as complicated as it might at first appear. So I've got to the end. I'm going to sneeze. Achoo, 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 achoo. Oh, excuse me. It's very, very warm here today. So I've got the windows open and I think I'm probably a little bit hay feverish. So I'm just finishing off the end and securing my stitches. I don't like hand sewing, but I find hand sewing binding really therapeutic. So you can see they are, I'm hoping you can see, they're really tiny stitches and you can hardly see them. And it just kind of holds the binding in place. And then on the back, you've got a lovely neat edge. So we're going to repeat the same thing at this end, hand stitching that binding on, and then our gusset will be completed. If you feel that you want to add a personal tag, so you know, if you've got a business tag or something like that, at one end of this gusset, 1/2 inch down from your binding, you can pop your tag centrally. Now, if you're going to use one of the metal tags that have got prongs on, obviously you probably need to put that on before you've put your lining on. Well, you will need to put that on before you put your lining on, and you'll need to put a bit of duct tape or something over the back of it to stop it rubbing on the lining. If you're hand stitching one on that has a couple of tags at each end, then you can just pop that on now. But yeah, this is a great place to pop your tag if you're going to use one. So I'm going to finish off the other end and then I'll be back to you with the next stage.